Good afternoon, and welcome to a CC Conversation on Anti-Racism. I'm Manya Whitaker. I'm an Associate Professor and Chair of Education here at Colorado College. I have the pleasure today to moderate our panel discussion about how two pandemics are affecting life here at Colorado College. But before we get started, I'd like to ask each panelist to introduce themselves, and in doing so, to share their initial reaction to CC's goal of becoming an anti-racist institution. I'd like to begin with Senior Associate Dean Fagan, followed by Senior Associate Dean Rodriguez, before we reintroduce ourselves to Senior Associate Dean Barbara Wilson.
Peony, you're muted.
Is that better? There we go. Thank you, Manya. Hi, everybody. I'm Peony Fagan, Senior Associate Dean for Equity, Inclusion, and Faculty Development, and I'm really happy to be here. To answer Manya's question about my original reaction to CC's anti-racism plan, I have to say I was pleasantly surprised. I've been engaged in anti-racist, feminist, social justice work for a very long time, and I did a lot of work at my previous institution, Wheaton College, and we had a diversity and inclusion strategic plan. But the word anti-racism wasn't often mentioned, and it definitely felt like a giant leap in terms of DEI work to actually know an institution that is using the word and using it as a front and center approach and framework to its work. So for me, it was a pleasant surprise. Before I turn it over, I'd like to ask everyone to please join us in acknowledging that Colorado College was founded upon exclusions and erasures of Black and Indigenous people. Colorado College is on the unceded land of the Ute, the Arapaho, the Comanche, and Cheyenne peoples. The land was worked by Black people who were often in servitude. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of racism and settler colonialism. Rosaly?
Thank you, Peony, for that reminder. I think it's an important context as we jump into this conversation. As Dr. Whitaker already mentioned, my name is Rosaly Rodriguez. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am Senior Associate Dean of Students for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Director of the Butler Center here at Colorado College. And I do share Dr. Fagan's sentiments that I was very pleasantly surprised as I began looking at Colorado College and this position. I have been in higher ed for nearly 20 years now, and I have yet to see an institution articulate a plan centered around anti-racism, not around diversity and inclusion. Some, have even gone as far as to look at the difference between equity and inclusion. But I have yet to see an institution really articulate a plan specifically around anti-racism. And that was a huge reason why I wanted to be a part of making this happen and moving this agenda forward here on campus. Thank you. Barbara?
Hi, everyone. My name is Barbara Wilson, and I'm serving as the Interim Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for staff. My other full-time job, I'm the Associate Vice President for Administrative Services. So I've been here 20 years. And so when the anti-racist plan came out, it was going on almost a year ago now, I think it was November. And I, as many others, said, how is this going to work? We're accustomed to nationwide a chief diversity officer model. I'll put that out there. So how is this going to work? I am so pleased that the college went this route. Having served now for about a month and a half, the amount of work to really become an anti-racist institution requires 3 leadership people. It's not just centered in one area. The plan won't be successful if it resides just with 3 people. While I'm interim, I thought, well, why am I doing this? This is not necessarily my background field. It's because the work is so important. It's going to require a team, and that we wanted to keep the attention and momentum for staff and employees. So I'm very honored. I'm working with two phenomenal, exceptional women who are professionals in this field.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. I know you're incredibly busy. So I want to start with fellow psychologist Dean Fagan and ask you to help us understand some terminology. So CC is committed to becoming an anti-racist institution, but not everyone fully understands what that means. What is anti-racism and how is it different from inclusion and equity? What happens when we confuse the terms or use them too rigidly, or perhaps most often when we use them too broadly?
Thank you, Manya, for asking these important questions to get our conversation going. So let me first start by defining diversity, equity, and inclusion before relating them to anti-racism. Historically, organizations focused only on diversity. This one word started to represent different aspects of problems in organizations and institutions, such as exclusionary practices, unfair policies, discrimination, microaggressions, inequality, and lack of representation. We now delineate between these challenges. They are now captured in the words diversity, equity, and inclusion. The word diversity refers to the degree to which people vary in their social identities and cultural backgrounds in an organization or institution. This variation inevitably means that different life experiences and perspectives are also represented. This is now often referred to as compositional or representational diversity. Research demonstrates that organizations and institutions function better with more compositional diversity. Equity is the degree to which policies and practices of an organization or institution take into account the varying needs of its members so they can thrive and succeed. You might be wondering what the difference is between equity and equality. In fact, historically, equality has been the focus in terms of establishing laws that mandate equal treatment in the workplace, when buying homes, when applying to colleges, when voting, etc. Work on equal rights historically and currently continue to be critically important. However, we now understand that equal treatment alone does not lead to equality. Why? Because institutional and systemic oppression of people from particular cultural groups, along with privileging people from particular cultural groups, have created such monumental gaps at all levels of societal functioning that equitable treatment is necessary to achieve equality. Finally, inclusion refers to the degree to which an organization or institution welcomes all of its members, encourages everyone to voice their perspectives, does things to make all members feel heard, empowers all members to influence the organization or institution, and fosters a sense of belonging among everyone. So now that I have defined diversity, equity, inclusion, I'll provide a brief overview of what anti-racism is before relating it to DEI. So anti-racism is an approach to understanding race, racism, and the evolution of racial ideology. This approach helps us understand the many ways that racism is embedded in the structures of US society, including schools, healthcare, local and federal governments, and banks. Anti-racism helps us better understand how race, racial ideology, and racism shape our understanding of ourselves and others. Anti-racism also provides a framework for how to dismantle racism at the individual, interpersonal, institutional, and structural levels. So anti-racism is an approach and framework that can be used at the organizational or institutional level to promote compositional diversity, to ensure equal treatment, to develop equitable practices and policies, and to promote organizational and institutional cultures that are inclusive. An anti-racist approach and framework will help us to continually work on diversity, equity, and inclusion at CC. We can use anti-racism to transform our community. As we learn how to use an anti-racist approach and framework, we will come to understand that it has impact beyond CC. It will help us better understand and address racism in Colorado Springs, in Colorado, in all the US states, and many of the countries around the world, where CC students and their families come from, and where CC alums and their families reside. So I will conclude my answer by summarizing what it means to be an anti-racist institution and what it means to be an anti-racist educator with 2 lists of actions. Note that these lists are not exhaustive. First, being an anti-racist institution means that CC community members use an anti-racist approach and framework to be anti-racist, to put race at the center of what we do as an institution, to understand the major forms of racism that we are fighting against, including individual, interpersonal, institutional, and structural racism, and also colorblind racism, to fight against all forms of racism, to fight against any isms that have infected the CC community, and to use an anti-racist lens to revise practices and policies and processes across the institution that are biased, inequitable, and lead to inequality. Second, being an anti-racist educator means using anti-racist pedagogy to explain race, racism, and the particular racial formation that develops in and around the classroom, a program, a department, and academic curriculums. To define the particular realms of experience that both individuals and groups find themselves in because of race. To explain how white supremacy impacts curricular design, classroom dynamics, and assessment tools. To discuss how racism is part of the structures and mechanisms of courses in teacher expectations for writing, and how teachers provide feedback, in what we value in terms of classroom behavior, and in how assignments are constructed and graded. To acknowledge the need and power in telling stories and offering narratives about anti-racist struggle and counter stories. To acknowledge narratives that convey white supremacy. To recognize the evolving needs of students to participate in the dominant and hegemonic, even at the cost of anti-hegemonic and anti-racist action. And finally, to reveal the difference in classrooms between feeling safe, feeling comfortable, and feeling brave. When it comes to race, racism, and anti-racist work, it is important that everyone feel brave. Unfortunately, we cannot guarantee that everyone will feel safe, though we strive for that at CC. It is also important that many also feel uncomfortable. It's only through discomfort that we grow, develop, and change for the better. Please note that the anti-racist educator list of actions is heavily based on the foreword called On Anti-Racist Agendas, written by Asao Anoy for the book Performing Anti-Racist Pedagogy, Rhetoric, Writing, and Communication.
Thank you so much for those clarifications that we desperately needed. If people listening are anything like me at all, I like to get in the nitty-gritty of the details of this. And so I want to ask Dean Rodriguez to expand upon a lot of what Dean Fagan said about what it means to be anti-racist by talking very briefly about what does it mean to apply an anti-racist lens to institutional functioning, right? What does that look like, and how does that address systemic racism?
Thank you for that question, Manya. I think it's so important because I believe that application is where we often get stuck. I want to provide a couple of examples, but when we talk theoretically about dismantling oppressive systems, usually that's met with very little opposition. However, when you start to point out very specific policies or procedures that are structurally racist, people often react very defensively. Further, there are times when we have to recognize that a system is not actually broken, but rather working the way it was exactly intended to by benefiting only certain groups. And that requires a complete overhaul rather than just kind of tinkering around the edges. So let's take, for example, what Barbara already brought up about CC's implementation of a 3-person diversity leadership model. In very few places would the response to saying, we're going to hire 3 full-time people to fulfill a need instead of 1 be met with contention. However, we're so ingrained to equate the concentration of power with our idea of leadership that many have struggled to fathom how 3 is better than 1 in this instance. The reality is a large part of applying an anti-racist lens is unlearning many of the things that we have accepted as true or taken for granted that they're just the way that things operate. That cognitive dissonance we feel when presented with this new framework is real and can be threatening or disorienting, and therefore naturally incur resistance. I want to take this a step further and think a little more broadly about the ways we signal worthiness in an academic setting. Having published in top-tier journals for faculty or scored in a specific range on the SAT or ACT for students are widely accepted measures of success in academic prowess, despite well-documented studies that show both of these markers were built for wealthy, white, male, and Judeo-Christian constituencies, and that they actively and knowingly disenfranchise other groups. Many top-tier journals, for instance, consider multicultural or feminist-focused studies to be specializations that are not worthy of their publication, but relegate them to secondary or tertiary journals. The SAT has long eliminated questions that the majority of white students score poorly on, but will keep questions laden with cultural bias that over 80% of Black students score poorly on. If we know that these things are built in a way that actively disenfranchises marginalized folks, but continue to uphold their value in determining access to our own institution, then we continue to uphold systemic racism. But if you tell a group of scholars that where they publish isn't as meaningful as they thought, or tell an admission board that standardized testing isn't a good measure of ability, it can be extremely, again, threatening. And still, that conversation is necessary. Part of applying this anti-racist framework is recognizing that concentration of power, credentialing, defensiveness, individualism are all parts of what Tema Okun lists as hallmarks of white supremacy culture. When we recognize these as patterns and can accept them not as personal flaws, but rather an unexamined lens that we have operated from, we can really begin to unlearn the practices and start to reorient ourselves toward this anti-racist lens.
Thank you. Thank you both, because now with that broad understanding of anti-racism, what it looks like on the ground, I want to turn our attention to the national landscape, where there continue to be protests and movements seeking to address race-based police brutality, seeking to address the disproportionate effects of COVID-19 on Black and Brown communities, and most recently, the women in ICE custody who are being coerced into having hysterectomies. It's easy to immediately see the entities at fault at the macro level, but I'd like to ask Dean Wilson to talk about how do we see these two pandemics of racism and health emerging at Colorado College?
Thank you. In order for me to talk about that intersection and what's happening at CC, I'm going to go back to the national level, because the magnitude of the inequities and the disparities that you just mentioned are high. They require attention. And one area right now, I'm going to talk about the health. So if you read the paper, all the research you want to do, there is now confirmed data and continued evidence that racial and ethnic groups, particularly Black and Latinx, are disproportionately affected by COVID across the nation. They are being harmed, infected by the virus at a higher rate, and nearly twice as likely to die from the virus as white people. If you didn't know, the New York Times had to file a lawsuit. They filed a Freedom of Information Act in order to obtain the CDC data to release the information that confirmed the the drastic disparities on the impact of COVID-19 on African American, Latino, and the Native American communities. Without that lawsuit, we wouldn't be able to have this data. So that there's more research now that's being shown to confirm those disparities. I'm going to throw some different elements also of this intersection. For people of color and women, disproportionately, they are represented in the front line hourly paid jobs right now. They're essential. And they have to continue working on site. We're talking healthcare, grocery stores, drivers, the warehouses, housekeeping. I was just reading an article recently, particularly the Latinx community working in homes to clean. They've not been able to clean. So there's no income coming there. And the articles were saying they are coming back into those homes. Turns out though, they have to be around people with COVID. There's a high risk that's associated there. Trades and crafts, childcare, all during this pandemic. And these jobs, many of them are exposed to the virus. It's a high risk. And again, the nature of these jobs cannot be done remotely, right? Another element, and I'll come back to that as I speak about Colorado College, is the wage inequities by gender and race. That's going on right now. The gender gap is a measurement to show how far yet the nation has to go for women to be paid equally and fully in our economy, particularly women of color. And I can go into some data, which I'm going to do really quickly. So based upon, this was early March of 2020. This is Bureau of Labor Statistics. I mean, there's data out there that tracks wage. And women are now earning 82 cents to the dollar of men, right? Then you take that to another level. And let me read that. Black women are typically paid 62 cents. Native American women, 57 cents. Latinas, just 54 cents for every dollar paid to white non-Hispanic male. And then there's numbers I can also go by race and for men. So keep that in mind. There's also the wage gap. In addition, women are, I'm going to say, workers of color, and women are being the hardest hit by the loss of jobs. The unemployment rate for Black and Latinx have the highest rate nationally. Again, I'm going to use the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is data that we rely on here at CC as well. September 2020, just last month. Then we can talk about who has access to healthcare, who doesn't have access to healthcare. I'm going to call this food insecurity. Hunger is real across the nation. Involuntary furloughs. Having to decide, am I going to pay my groceries, my utility bills, a roof over my head? This is happening across the nation. And again, the disparities and the inequities for people of color is so high. So I'm going to set that up. Let me talk briefly about Colorado College. We're a small community. We're like a small town, right? And we have similar scenarios. In order for Colorado College to meet its mission, CC is requiring many of our employees to come to work, on site in particular. And having worked in human resources, I know the data. Many of our positions that are hourly paid, frontline positions, are representative of women and people of color. And their jobs are essential, no doubt about it, and they take their jobs seriously. We're talking about facilities, we're talking mail services, campus safety, student life, children's center, finance. So they're here, right? We've been fortunate at Colorado College compared to other employers across the nation and even higher education. We have been able to maintain wages for full-time benefit eligible employees, unless their employment has ended, because there have been those situations. Our temporary occasional employees are not working right now. We're limiting who's on campus. Compared to other employers, I would say our health plan, our premiums are reasonable. Many of our employees have signed up and they participate. So access to health care has continued. Human Resources reminded us last week that they will conduct a pay equity study next year. That's important when I talked about wages. And we talk to the co-presidents weekly, and they are aware of that disparate impact that puts racial and ethnic groups at an increase of getting sick, of having income gaps, of having to care for children at home or other members of their family. So what is occurring now, starting to occur, is intentional attention on policies. What's changing right now? What needs to change? Decisions that need to be made. And how is it being communicated, and how will it affect the community? Rosaly could also talk there that she's done some studies on even COVID and the impact of students, particularly students of color. We're having these discussions now at the college. In July of this year, the state of Colorado passed a Healthy Family and Workforce Act. And this act requires all employees be provided up to 2 weeks of paid sick leave based on 3 categories that have to do with COVID-19. So if you're interested, contact Human Resources. About a week and a half ago, Colorado College on its own announced a temporary benefit of relief for full-time hourly and exempt staff who are working 100% of the time, whether at home or on site. And that announcement stated, we recognize that our staff may need time off from work for self-care and well-being beyond what is covered by college provided paid leaves. The leaves available through the end of this year consists of 6.5 days. Contact HR if you want more information. The last piece, I think, coming in with my background of the national scale and here within CC, is supervisors. You make a difference. Department chairs, you make a difference in the work life here at Colorado College. When you talk about people, why do you stay at a job? What keeps you here? It's my supervisor. It's how I'm treated. Is there inclusion? Do people care about me? So supervisors, exercise some empathy, exercise your grace, talk to your employees, understand their personal commitments, what's going on in their lives. Do they have children to care for? Do they have personal health issues that they need to be aware of? Is there a possibility for some flexibility, alternate work schedules? Just be in tune to support them. And I got a shout out to two people that work with me. April Scriven, Male Services Supervisor, Danielle Martinez, Children's Center Director. They have a mission, they have a responsibility on the college. And yet they're the first ones to talk about their employees, checking in with them and reminding me, we've got to consider this as the college makes these decisions. Thank you.
What I've heard from the first 3 answers from each of you is that it's obvious that different people across campus who occupy different social positions, as well as different spaces on campus, have very different concerns and different priorities when it comes to implementing our anti-racist institutional plan. So my next question is for each of you, though. How do you plan to include your key constituents' voices and concerns in your work, given that you work collaboratively as a team? And I'll start with you, Dean Fagan.
Thank you for that question, Manya. So the work I do with faculty, I don't see it as my work per se. It is their work. That is, I am a guide for their work. I think of it as it being up to each faculty member to do what they need to make necessary changes on an individual level, on the interpersonal level, on the department program level, and across faculty leadership to support CC's goal of being an anti-racist institution. Therefore, I really do work together with faculty. I listen to faculty, I hear their voices so that I better understand how to support them in this work.
Thank you. Dean Rodriguez?
Sure. I think much like Dr. Fagan, I see myself as an advocate or a microphone for student concerns. I think right now it is essential to be very intentional about how I connect with students because they don't know me. I started in the middle of the pandemic and most of my work has been online. And so the organic ways that we kind of fall into meeting and talking with each other isn't really available. So I have begun intentionally meeting with some students and listening to their concerns and talking about the areas where they would like to see change. What has been their experiences? What are some of the things that have already, that I would not know because I wasn't here prior. And I hope to increase that now that we're hopefully settling into a bit of a rhythm for the semester, setting up more meetings and encouraging and inviting folks from different areas to come and talk with me. I read very carefully and very, and hopefully thoughtfully, the communication that students send to me. So recently, actually just yesterday, I received, I think, 3 different emails concerning the same questions about our relationship with the Colorado Springs Police Department. And, you know, I don't know enough about what that relationship has been to be able to respond immediately to students, but I do take it very seriously as something that I need to inform myself of and get to know more about what that relationship has been and what the expectations of the college will be with that, about that relationship going forward. I'm also making it a priority to listen to my colleagues who have been here and heard from students about those experiences and incorporating those into the lens that I'm taking as I'm making recommendations about what we should do moving forward.
It's a good question. There's a couple things that are in the works. I've reached out to staff council to request a meeting with them and to seek their assistance for me, for the team, to start connecting with staff, employees, and begin a dialogue on the plan. I'm certain the majority of staff and maybe even faculty still do not have a thorough understanding on the meaning to be an anti-racist institution. And that was our first question, to really unpack that and be able to have substantive conversations. What do they think about that? Because you have to start there versus over here. Now this is what we're going to do. And for employees to really understand their role to advance the plan. We also are, I believe, we're considered members of the Diversity, Equity, and Advisory Board, and we'll be reaching out to them as another resource and avenue to be able to communicate with the campus community and engage in those conversations. We meet with the co-presidents weekly. We get to hear what's on their mind. We get to share what's on our mind and what we're hearing. The team has been contacted by a number of departments and committees already wanting to understand and develop their understanding, their practices through the DEI lens within their scope of responsibilities. I've already set up a few meetings and we'll continue with human resources. Certainly we're looking at staff policies, recruitment and hiring practices, various policies, and we're available as a resource as well to the college leadership in that regard.
One of the concerns when CC decided to have this 3-person team as opposed to the CDO that Dean Wilson mentioned earlier, one of the concerns was that these were also figurehead positions that didn't actually have the ability to do anything. So we've had a question from one of our participants in the audience about how much power do you all have collectively to actually affect meaningful change at Colorado College? Whoever wants to take it.
I will start by saying I have really appreciated the spaces where I've been invited to bring the DEI lens. I'm on the COVID advisory leadership team. I'm not an epidemiologist. I studied biology many, many years ago as an undergraduate. And so it's not a space that I would naturally think, the Dean of Students for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion might be included, right? But it was really important, and the request from Dean Edmonds, or from Co-President, Edmonds, was to make sure that we are applying this anti-racism framework to all of our decisions, including COVID. And so being asked into those spaces where we are making recommendations actively on a regular basis to the cabinet about how we are going to approach. For instance, we just, the decisions about repopulating campus and making that switch, and having the ability to advocate in that space for the need to not just meet the needs of students who are going to need to take labs in person, but also students who don't have a safe or at home at all to go to, and making sure that we are being equitable and making sure that they have access still to a CC education, even without a safe learning environment that is not our campus. So seeing what we can do in those spaces. So for me, I feel like all of the things that I have been asked to comment on so far have been incorporated in one way, shape, or form. I just was invited to another group to talk about it, exactly what Barbara had already mentioned, really making sure that we're paying attention to the disparate rates of COVID impact and the racial composition and what that looks like on campus. We don't want to see that mirroring on campus what it does in the broader community, because that would have some really serious impacts for us if we start having two separate campuses where students of color are essentially in quarantine and white students are not. And so that, again, that request was taken very seriously. We're implementing some changes in the way we track that information so that we can pay attention to it. So we know and are able to respond proactively and not just reactively when we get ourselves into that framework.
I'll speak up, having been at the college a long time. These positions are different. All three positions report to college leadership. It's not just one position that's, it's in one division and within a hierarchy. There are voices that we now have. There's a plan with the responsibility to implement that. There, for lack of a better way, there's teeth. There is follow through with the team and the model and what is ahead for the college and for us to help foster the implementation of the plan.
I'll just quickly add to build on what Rosaly and Barbara have said. It's interesting, going back to a point that Rosaly made about viewing the CDO as maybe more powerful than three people. And sort of building on that, I feel like I have impact both in the work that I do with faculty and academic affairs directly that may be more distant if it were just one CDO. But, and I do feel as if the community, whether faculty or staff, welcome support in figuring out how to move the plan forward. And so with that comes a way in which we're not just included, but our expertise is honored. And I have felt that. And so in that is power, because folks ask us for our expertise, our advice, and we are, as has already been said, heard, but heard also in having an impact on three different constituents more directly than someone who's sitting in a CDO position. So in fact, the power and the impact, I believe, is greater. And back to the point, three really is greater than one, not to be simplistic about it, but I do see it playing it out just that way.
If I can just add one more thought too, because while we are in faculty, student, and staff, I'm gonna say staff/employees, we're not operating in silos. We share, we bounce ideas, that cross those three areas. It's very important. So we are aware of what's going on over in the student side or on the employee side. That's very important for the plan and for to be an anti-racist institution to forge ahead in that partnership.
Thank you. So I'm back to my concrete things, right? So, and I know others who are here want to know, what exactly have we done to make progress in our plan so far? I'm on the faculty side as a professor, so I've been I have firsthand knowledge of our progress there, but not everyone is aware of what's going on holistically around the campus. So I'd love for each of you to talk about what have you seen progress been made in what areas, and then what do we still have left to do?
I'll start since I've been here the longest, and I certainly know that Rosaly and Peony will speak further because my world has been more on staff side. So just like you said, Manya, you know quite a bit of what's been going on the faculty side. There have been a number of activities and tangos. Sometimes we move ahead and then we step back. A lot of talk with no action. But over the years, there has been progress to place, I'm going to say, importance and attention to mitigating those isms, right, on an individual and institutional level. I'm going to mention just a few, which I think are pretty important milestones. Certainly, though, you can go to the CC homepage and into the search section, put diversity timelines. You're going to see information from the past. Some of it's not as current, but you're going to get a good flavor. So for many years, we had a Women's Concerns Committee and a Minority Concerns Committee, very important, made up of faculty and staff. Their focus was on primarily recruitment and probably the campus climate. I would say, while they were very important, it lacked that power and authority that was needed. And around, I think, 2015, Manya, the Faculty Executive Committee replaced that with the Diversity, Equity, and Advisory Board, an advisory board to the president on all matters of diversity and equity for faculty and staff. I'm going to say in 2016, 2017, the introduction of personal pronouns, chosen names, gender identity. Now, some may say that's slow. The rest of the world was already doing this, but we finally got on board, modified our voluntary application app, and that's now our communication. In 2012, 2013 was building on the block, the strategic plan. There was a recommendation, focus on the workplace excellence, that focused on diversity for a diverse and inclusive campus, professional development program where Journey to Inclusion came about. During that time, former Dean Wong and I co-chaired a group of faculty and staff recruitment and retention. And many of those ideas have taken shape now. We still need to go back and look at some more of those as well. We also, I call this giving someone else your watch and saying, what time is it? We conducted 2 climate surveys. We used an external business that partners with the Chronicle of Higher Education to assess higher ed institutions. We were able to personalize statements that included diversity. That feedback that we received, which we got in 2016, has led us to where we are now. They said that progress has been made, but we still need clearer, effective procedures with dealing with discrimination. And the college needs to have more of an emphasis on a diverse faculty, administration, and staff. I'll just mention another one, and that has to do with policies. Policies were updated. We have an anti-discrimination and gender-based discrimination policy, sexual harassment and sexual violence policy. So I'll pause there for my colleagues.
I can go. So in my short time here, I'll share kind of what I've learned about what's been done and also what's in the works in terms of faculty-facing kinds of progress with respect to the anti-racist plan. First is I developed a more robust DEI development program for faculty searches that includes a just-in-time approach. It includes sort of meeting with each faculty search and going over information that will decrease bias and increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in the search process based on whatever particular phase that was going on in the search at a given time. So rather than conveying the information all at once, either in a half-a-day workshop, this allows faculty search committees to engage in processing and figuring out how to apply best strategies in sessions that I hold based on, for example, the position description, based on how you review applicant materials, best strategies for interviewing candidates when it's at that point in the search process. And And, you know, we have a fair number of searches going on this academic year. And this program also provides faculty an opportunity to think through biases and assumptions. So it's not just about best practices related to the nuts and bolts of the faculty search process. Also embedded in this program is opportunity to think about bias, affinity bias, for example, and other forms of bias. I also know, and I'm sort of getting up to speed on the work that some departments and programs have already done in terms of articulating in a summary report what they are doing and what they plan to do around supporting the anti-racist plan. What are they doing in terms of department and program policies? What they're doing in terms of thinking about anti-racist pedagogy. And so departments and programs have started to do that. And I actually will be meeting with each department and program to begin a conversation with each one in terms of where they're at with respect to what they've said they're going to do, and to support departments and programs that have yet to write that summary, that need further support around that. So, but nonetheless, I think there has been you know, a good 12, 15 that have already done that, which I think is a great start. Finally, I'm working with my colleagues across campus to put together a suite of faculty development programs. For example, thinking about a more structured, more robust and intentional pre-tenure mentorship program that, speaking of listening to voices, pre-tenure faculty have spoken loud and clear that there needs to be a more robust mentorship program, that it's been either ad hoc or at times not even existed, right? So working with colleagues to put together a more robust program that in fact does impact not just pre-tenured faculty, but many pre-tenured faculty are also BIPOC folks, just given the nature and the cycle of wanting to attract and recruit more BIPOC faculty who end up being pre-tenured faculty and are asking for more robust mentorship program. And then finally, also thinking about leadership across the faculty and the pivotal critical role of chairs and program directors. And so putting together a chairs directors development program that supports chairs and directors throughout the year with respect to the many kind of levels of leadership that they engage in with their department and program. And embedded in that program, of course, will be addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion within their department and programs. So that just sort of gives you a taste of some of the suite of faculty development programs that I'm engaged in working on with a variety of folks across campus.
And I think I have a unique position in that I came into inheriting a very talented staff who has already been in very much the practice of creating anti-racist spaces for students on campus and doing teaching and learning for many years across campus. And so those pieces have continued, and we are looking at growing them in addition. So spaces like Mind, Body, Soul, which is, you know, for femme-identified women of color, the LGBTQ plus groups, and I can forget many of them. There's quite a few that I can't name all of them, are continuing to operate, and a first gen program, for instance. And those are some of the spaces where I'm seeing the most participation from students. I think we all recognize that this virtual environment is quite exhausting. And I think it speaks to volumes about what students know they get from those spaces, that they are attending consistently and really enthusiastically in those spaces. We're also continuing to do the teaching and learning pieces, the training pieces with student groups. I actually met yesterday with the advisory committee for student athletes to talk about developing a framework of training and how they can hold teams accountable for continuing to participate in ongoing learning and anti-racism education, both as a team, but also collectively. And so we started talking about what a framework for that would look like, and how do we hold folks accountable and take into account not just a one and done kind of training, but a an ongoing series that builds upon the skills and utilizes the more senior members of athletics. And we're talking about these same things in teaching and learning more broadly in the Butler Center about how we empower student leaders who have done those basic trainings to become partners with us in leading those trainings and opening up those spaces and utilizing the skills that they've had to join us in co-creating more opportunities for that. Additionally, the three of us are actually meeting with Anusha Kunal, who is the chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee on the CCSGA on a regular basis to talk about not just what we're doing, but what's happening in CCSGA and having a strong relationship and making sure that she's feeling supported and that we're also getting information that we might not get in other spaces. I think it's been, and this is, I can't claim responsibility for this. I can only report that I've been really pleasantly surprised to see how many spaces where student voices are being brought into very high level committees like the COVID advisory team that I mentioned before, where it's very intentional to make sure that international student voices in this conversation about how we're responding to COVID are being heard. Off-campus students' voices are being heard. Those different constituencies in all the committees that I am a part of have student voice and representation, which I think is really essential. And seeing some of the ways, especially my colleagues in international studies have been able to continuously pivot as we get guidance after guidance and executive order after executive order that really is throwing, I think, the entire international community into quite a level of uncertainty that we've not seen before, that their response has been amazing. And early on, I was just really impressed with their ability to create a study abroad experience in China so that students who are in China can continue their CC education in ways that they would not have been because of some of the visa barriers here. And it's that kind of really creative thinking by many of my colleagues that I think are often in back doors or back channels that we don't think of as necessarily these grandiose anti-racism efforts, but they truly are what that looks like in action. And I've been really impressed to see what my colleagues have done.
Thank you. So we have about 7 minutes left, and I like to end these types of conversations with resources, right? So a lot of folks around the country and here at CC have begun the process of engaging in book clubs, such as How to Be an Anti-Racist. The author came and spoke here last year, also Right Fragility, and I know the Dean's Office sponsored attendance at some workshops that Robin DeAngelo was facilitating. And there's also been a lot of critique around these texts and other texts as well. But I'd love to hear you all speak briefly about some recommendations you have for people who do want to further their learning and how they should engage with texts that can sometimes be controversial. So I'll actually start back with you, Dean Rodriguez.
Sure. And I will keep my comments brief, but my advice is essentially to remember that these texts are salient. They are not sacred. I think folks have a tendency to look for a singular voice or almost sacred text to gain all of the knowledge on this topic. And it's really essential to understand that a singular text does not exist, and in my opinion, should not exist. It's what Chimamanda Adichie calls the danger of a singular story. Looking to one book it concentrates power in the way that we just talked about, being really a hallmark of white supremacist culture. And that it is important to read these books and to also read, as you mentioned, the critiques of these books, and to read other books that you haven't heard of from authors that maybe are not as familiar to you because they're not on the New York Times bestseller list. Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins, Layla Saad, the list goes on. There are two books that have been really salient to me that never show up in any of these spaces. One is called Sensi Pensante. It's Sensing Thinking Pedagogy from Laura Rendon, which really argues for educating for wholeness and liberation and calls for us to stop divorcing the intellectual from the emotional. The other is Confronting Environmental Racism. I think we hear often that science and social justice don't go together. And I think very early in my career, Robert Bullard's book on that was my first contextualization into putting anti-racism practice into a framework into practice. Although at that time it wasn't necessarily called anti-racism, it was just literally called environmental racism, but is a really important and salient book that I would recommend to anyone.
I can go next. So to build on what Rosaly was just talking about in terms of, not the texts that are just front and center or on the New York Times bestseller list, although those are books that are great to get started. But I was thinking about books that are perhaps a bit more classic, books that you often, see the authors referred to, right? So such as The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. It was written in 1970s, but it's amazing how applicable it is now. And it's a smaller book, but it's so powerful, and particularly in relation to what Rosaly was talking about in terms of emotional, holistic approach to teaching individuals from a variety of backgrounds. And so I recently read that book and it really had an impact on me. And I think it will have on others too who've not been exposed to it. Also, it's not quite a classic like The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but it was written a bit ago. And I do think it is important for folks who are doing this work to be steeped in more knowledge about history. And so The History of White People by Neil Irvine, I think is a really, really useful read. And I also suggest, exposing yourself to podcasts. There's actually a podcast, the Colorado Matters podcast, actually their September 25th episode. They interviewed Neil Irvine talking about her book, and it's called Historian, Racism is Real, Race is Ideology. So sometimes approaching a book like that, starting with listening to a podcast and an interview with the author is a nice way to get acquainted. And finally, I would recommend the podcast called Black Wall Street 1921. Again, it just getting acquainted with some history, I think, is really grounding. And this particular podcast delves into a number of historical events that have occurred. And I think it's really, really useful to listen to. It's with Nia Clark.
So my background is human resources. It's relationships. It's building relationships. I'm going to recommend one, and it's Emotional Intelligence 2.0 by Travis Bradbury and Jean Greaves. I think it's important in order to have conversations, examine your own biases, because it's talking about changing habits. Emotional intelligence looks at a reflection of your own self-awareness, self-management of relationships, social awareness, and how, again, are you going to manage relationships? Because all of us in the workplace in particular should be striving to have successful, respectful, cordial relationships that meet both our needs. Another book I'm almost done reading, and it was actually by a colleague who was the chief diversity officer at Metro State College of Denver, which is now called a university. It's called Fix Your Climate, a practical guide to reducing microaggressions, microbullying, and bullying in the academic workplace. Very practical. There's guides, and I think this is what we will also need here at Colorado College.
Thank you all so much. We are out of time. I want to thank you all for attending, whether it was in this webinar or on Facebook Live. We will be recording this and we will upload it in some time once we can get everything fixated and gotten together. We'll definitely share that with the community. Thank you so much, and thank you 3 panelists for participating. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Manya.
Thank you, Manya.
Thank you, Manya.
Bye.
Bye.